I'm really proud of you. We're doing this. Lecture 3. Thank you very much. This came about, I think, might sound a little defensive. I started reading some uh, articles, op-eds in like 2001, 2002 that said trauma studies was irrelevant or overused. Everything is trauma. Only academics talk about trauma. So this is kind of a defensive defense of trauma studies, and I'm curious again to hear what you have to say about that. All right, so we're ready. Another about 45 minutes, and then we'll leave time at the end to discuss quotations and questions. So start thinking early about passages you might want to discuss at the end. So this lecture originated in a book review I wrote of a new work on trauma studies, bringing my scholarship up to date in the 2020s. Interestingly, the book itself by John Ziolkowski looks back 100 years to find lessons for the current day. A descendant of people who once lived where Franz Kafka lived, my surname means son of Pozor or son of caution in Czech, I am drawn to the idea that we can learn a lot about trauma from Franz Kafka as well as Sigmund Freud. For this lecture, I would like to thank Jennifer Usen and the editorial staff at Journal of Modern Literature, which invited me to review John Ziolkowski's book. So first, an overview of Ziolkowski's argument about trauma. John Ziolkowski's The Language of Trauma comprehensively links such authors as E.T.A. Hoffmann, Sigmund Freud, and Franz Kafka, revealing that their familiar notions of the uncanny are not simply mystifying universal concepts, but rather deeply rooted in the entanglements of overlapping historical discourses grounded in a trauma of modernity itself. So think about the railway accident or the train accident again. I was reading this book coming out of a personal illness, as well as our international attempts to convey the COVID-19 pandemic, while at the same time popular media was criticizing trauma studies as irrelevant and disconnected from the problems of the real world. It led me to want to defend trauma studies more than ever. I was thinking in 2020, now is the time for a discourse on trauma where contemporary or like popular magazines were saying trauma is now more irrelevant than ever. So I was trying to bring those two closer together. So I'll start a little with my personal history of illness, kind of connecting back to the last presentation. And it starts with some words and acronyms. Amy Pozorski, FH of RA. It is the referral letter my primary care physician instructed me to deliver to my orthopedist. The letter sat in my lap in the waiting room, staring up at me, challenging me to provide an alternative cause for why I am there, propped up from a left knee effusion. Why could I not walk? The doctor's scrawl translates to family history, that's FH, of rheumatoid arthritis, RA. As much an update for the orthopedist I have not yet met as a signal to the insurance company that my complaints of massive knee swelling are legitimate and not the hysterical ravings of an academic in summer. I needed a piece of paper from a doctor to get treatment from another doctor, and that doctor needed to sign a piece of paper for my insurance company to cover it. That was my status as patient. I had been using the referral letter as a bookmark in John Ziolkowski's relevant and timely study, The Language of Trauma, and as I sat in the waiting room watching the patients check in one by one, I was struck by two things. Our uncanny resemblance to the war cripples in Otto Dix's 1920 oil painting reproduced on the cover of Ziolkowski's book, and the idiosyncratic and arbitrary nature of American insurance coverage. It may seem at first glance that the referral jargon, FH of RA, family history of rheumatoid arthritis, which simultaneously fails and succeeds in describing my predicament, had nothing to do with Ziolkowski's book. The language of trauma, after all, signals with its subtle subtitle alone its interest in how three influential writers of the time, the Romantic writer E.T.A. Hoffmann, Sigmund Freud, whom we've talked a lot about, and Franz Kafka, attempted to articulate the experience of trauma as independent from a blunt force injury in a period bracketed by emergence of the railroad and press coverage of accidents in World War I. So Ziolkowski's question is, how is trauma theory born out of this moment that includes World War I and frequent railway accidents? My position in the waiting room that day, filled with so many patients who have injuries with seemingly no cause, patients who have hobbled in with ace bandages, crutches, and wheelchairs like Dix's War Cripples painting, in fact share the same problem the book theorizes in compelling and provocative ways. The inability of language to describe a straightforward cause-effect relationship between triggers and trauma, on the one hand, and the even more troublesome ability to tell multiple stories explaining causes when we in fact only know with any firm grounding the effects. I think that's one of the problems of the medical field maybe, or the problems of being a patient, is as a patient you walk in with all of these symptoms, right? You know the effects of something, and it is the job of the medical practitioner to locate a cause. The problem there is it could be any number of causes, any number of factors, and that's something that Ziolkowski is trying to figure out from a literary perspective. What does that tell us about how language works and causality? Ziolkowski's book begins with a robust acknowledgments page citing in gratitude the leading trauma theorist Kathy Carruth, who was then at Cornell, who had invited Ziolkowski to present drafts of the book publicly, as well as librarians and archivists in Europe. In this way, the book signals its pedigree and methodology, grounded in a specific kind of trauma theory that arises from deconstructive readings of Freud in the manner of Carruth on the one hand, and close readings of new archival material on the other hand. I'll just kind of remind you that, like, somebody used the word disciple, and I think that's right. Kathy Carruth, like, teaching where she taught, who is a very dynamic thinker and teacher, it kind of gave rise to another generation of trauma theorists. Ziolkowski is one of them. And I say that kind of knowing that there are all kinds of brands of trauma theory, all kinds of ways of talking about this. And the Carruthian approach is very kind of specific. It comes out of that Yale School of Deconstruction, right, at the same time as Holocaust studies was picking up there. So the Ziolkowski book is a very kind of Carruthian book also. Ziolkowski employs his language and research skills on a comprehensive argument about the literature of Hoffmann, Freud, and Kafka, arguing that their familiar notions of the uncanny are not simply mystifying concepts, but deeply rooted in the entanglements of history. Ziolkowski opens his book by establishing his interest in the traumatic scene of a railway accident, a scene that perplexed 19th century thinkers as diverse as Charles Dickens and Sigmund Freud. Ziolkowski, in this context, establishes his dual purpose for writing the book: to add to other works that are likewise quietly permeated by war and by industrial trauma, especially that associated with travel by railway. I hadn't thought about at the time, like, how pervasive this kind of horror of the railway accident had been in the 19th century. And second, to connect the medical language of trauma with the language of skepticism in Romanticism and modernism, specifically through the two discourses' obsession with inscrutability, that is, an attempt to talk about what cannot be talked about, scrutinized. Ziolkowski's reading of texts spanning two seemingly disparate literary traditions, Romanticism and modernism, requires him to read across boundaries, not only in terms of the accepted periodization of literary scholarship, but in terms of genre as well. Closely reading examples from Romanticism, that's Hoffman's The Sandman. I don't have time to talk about that today, but it's really interesting. There's this like pairing of The Sandman with Freud's reading of it. From fiction mixed with science and philosophy, that's Freud's The Uncanny. And from literary modernism's Kafka's Metamorphosis and Selected Stories, Ziolkowski's project enacts the very resistance to categorization that he reads thematically in the texts themselves. The figure of the railway accident, its exemplary status in resisting representation and appeal across genres and disciplines, has long fascinated trauma theorists. In a 2000 interview with the Connecticut Review, for example, Carruth discusses how the accident features in the genealogy not only in her work, but in the tradition overall. So we've talked about applications of trauma theory in terms of history, in terms of socially produced trauma. I'd also like to add the idea of accident to this conversation. For Carruth, the example of the traumatic accident in Freud appears as the prime example of the event that causes trauma. Trauma is itself an event that is, in the one sense, the most immediate of experiences and the least experiential. Just as the flashbacks seem overwhelmingly visual and yet cannot be described as traditionally perceptual or phenomenal. In Freud, too, this encounter must be read in his text not only at the level of the concept, but at the level of the figure. For example, as I have suggested, this is Carruth, she's long paragraph, in the figures of departure and awakening, and to this extent the theory retains a literary element. So the link between trauma theory and Romanticism for me is itself an entanglement of concept, figure, and accident. Romantic writers write obsessively about the railway accident. Sigmund Freud writes obsessively about the railway accident. The accident is a literal fact of history, but it also becomes a metaphor for departure and return, for inscrutability, for the industrial age. So when she talks about the concept and the figure, she's looking at the railway accident as having two rhetorical modes. For Carruth, as for Ziolkowski, trauma as a discipline, a method, and an epistemology requires us to consider the intersection between concept or theme or argument and metaphor or figure or literary device on the other hand. When Carruth argues that trauma theory and Romanticism are linked via a quote-unquote entanglement, she suggests that one cannot decouple the accident as a traumatic fact in the world from the accident as a metaphor for the impossibility of capturing its essence in traditional language or even time. Although Ziolkowski makes little of this connection, Freud himself writes about the similarities between the railway collision and trench warfare back in Book 2 of his 1920 work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and in Moses and Monotheism. Most readers guided by Carruth's groundbreaking 1996 book Unclaimed Experience will associate Freud's Book 2 with the strange juxtaposition of the child's game and reality of soldiers fighting in the trenches of World War I. That's where we started today, right? But this chapter actually begins by comparing the terrible war with the railway collision of another accident. Freud opens the chapter this. Thus, so this is back to the beginning of Book 2, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, the child's Fort Da game, right? The soldier waking up in a traumatic nightmare that astonishes people too little. The chapter begins with this. After severe shock of a mechanical nature, railway collision, or other accident in which the danger to life is involved, a condition may arise which has long been recognized and to which the name traumatic neurosis is attached. The terrible war that is just over has been responsible for an immense number of such maladies and at least has put an end to the inclination to explain them on the basis of organic injury to the nervous system due to the operation of mechanical force. So he's saying we have to stop thinking that people have symptoms of a traumatic event, like decoupled from a blow to the head. You can have one or the other. They can be at the same time. They don't need to be at the same time. Given that post-traumatic stress disorder would not be defined in the Diagnostic Statistician's Manual until well after the Vietnam War in 1980, it astonishes people far too little, to borrow from Freud, over 50 years earlier, that Freud is beginning to wonder why survivors of accidents and wars, situations in which a danger to life is involved, show psychological effects even though they have suffered no physical contact to their brains. In this moment, we see the beginnings of trauma theory's interest in the problem of witness, which could also be understood as the problem of confronting death and then coming out the other side, traumatic survival. It is as though the unconscious has stepped in to save the victims from psychically experiencing the unimaginable, the unforeseen, or rather, that the unimaginable remains illegible to the conscious mind, though it may be written elsewhere. It is no coincidence, then, that at the turn of the last century, linguistic and psychoanalytic philosophers alike began to theorize what we only later started to describe as the problem of reference. Deconstructive critics, in particular, love this phrase, the problem of reference. Ziolkowski usefully recapitulates the status of Ferdinand de Saussure, who prepared a foundation for his method of reading the Romantic and Modernist authors at the core of his study. He reminds us that in 1906, de Saussure's course in linguistics theorizes that the linguistic sign is composed of a signifier and signified. Are there any linguists in here? Okay, you're like, signifier and signified. And the relationship between the two is arbitrary, deepening the felt sense of a crisis of signification. Taking the cue from Freud, the psychoanalyst, and Franz Kafka, the insurance associate, Ziolkowski reflects that the new, uninjured body suffering from the traumatic effects of modern weapons and vehicles resisted medical semiotics. The symptom no longer refers to the physical substrate. The connection between language and symptoms seems arbitrary. How do you define that? For Ziolkowski, this was not only a problem for linguists, analysts, and insurance adjusters. It affected the medical field. This is Ziolkowski. The 19th and early 20th century discourses of medical trauma and language of skepticism converged in this disconnection of the signifier from the signified. Although medical researchers never stated this, they knew implicitly that medical symptoms resembled linguistic signs. I love that. It's very uncomfortable to think about like our medical professionals having to deal with this problem. Working his way back from the profession, Ziolkowski brings these questions of the day to, quote, a traumatic form of narration he sees in the literary periods of Romanticism and Modernism. The traumatic form of narration is recognizably uncanny, familiar but not familiar. A connection pointed up by 3 exemplary cases where important writers use form to match their thematic concerns about the traumatic and often undecipherable nature of the modern age. What's particularly valuable about Ziolkowski's argument is the specificity of his formal readings and archival connection, perhaps especially at those moments where one might imagine arguments about these writers that seem all too familiar. In his hands, they become strange again, structured by medical legal discourses and crises of meaning that they can neither fully articulate nor fail to announce constantly. I think that we think about Franz Kafka as this writer of the absurd, right? The metamorphosis, kind of think about what it means to wake up as a cockroach. And Ziolkowski's like, this man worked in bureaucracy. He was an insurance person, right? This is why he writes with like such absurd scenarios. Like he's kind of thinking about his professional life, which I find really interesting. We have already seen Freud's interest in depicting the indirect causation of trauma in World War I. The uncanny, Zelkowski argues, Freud theorizes the effect of an unexpected return of the repressed, drawing on the figure of the soldier who had been buried alive and survives to tell about it. It is such a strong example that Zelkowski wonders why Freud is so elusive and indirect. After all, argues Zelkowski, such a theory does not exist without one of the often forgotten effects of war, which is the fear of being buried alive. Allegorically speaking, we may read the premature burial as an allegory for personal and social repression. It is no accident, says Zelkowski, that Freud uses such phrases as work of spades, which, like Ernst Simmel's mining work, to connect the language of analysis with the language of burial and the trenches of war. Such language also appears in Kafka's The Burrow, which features a creature buried in a series of tunnels called a trench. So that's another motif throughout, being buried alive. Zelkowski is reading in these 19th century texts. It's in his chapter entitled Trains, Wars, and Kafka's Aesthetics of Indeterminacy that Zelkowski returns to the inextricable relationship between the trains of modernity and modern wars, via Kafka's frustration working in accident insurance, particularly his frustration attempting to locate a single cause for other people's suffering. For Kafka, this wasn't simply a problem of history, but a problem of language as well. So this is Zelkowski writing about Kafka's literature of trauma, I would say. Kafka's Poetics of Indeterminacy is both and simultaneously literary and historical political. It is a response to the linguistic aspects of Kafka's entire business of accidental insurance. Kafka is reacting to the medical legal insistence that we locate a single material cause for the traumatic symptoms of modernity. Kafka is saying, as an insurance person, I can tell you that it's impossible to locate a single cause, right? And this is something that trauma theorists and artists and authors are also kind of thinking about. So the connection between the business and bureaucracy of insurance and philosophy and theory and literature, I think is this fascinating. How do you locate a single material cause for trauma? Zelkowski links insurance and medicine as deeply implicated industries, a problem Kafka knew all too well. And here I begin to see the significance of his work not only for trauma studies, but for narrative medicine. Even further, we can see anew the ways the fields of trauma studies and narrative medicine are themselves deeply interwoven in the struggle with the problem of reference, of origins, and they both struggle with society's need to find a single material cause to explain problems of body and mind that are infinitely more complex. Early critics of trauma studies and deconstruction say, these people, they say there is no truth. How do you exist in a world where you can say there is no truth? And over here, people like Kafka and Zelkowski and Carruth and Deman would say, that's not what we're saying. We are saying there are many possible truths, and that is something important to grapple with. So Zelkowski uses as his exemplary literary case from Kafka his unfinished 1907 novel, Wedding Preparations in the Country and the Metamorphosis from 1912, to closely read the way that Kafka hints initially at the possibility of railway hysteria, only to subvert the idea of a single diagnosis for a single external cause, through such literary devices as overdetermination, hyperbole, and irony. But it is not only medicine and the traumatic effects of the modern age that motivated Kafka's writing. For Zelkowski, the driving force of Kafka's insistence on indeterminacy is the insurance industry. For Zelkowski, Kafka's fictional destruction of causality leans in this direction, yet with an added medical legal twist stemming from his interest in the problem of insurance. It is that sharp phrasing, medical legal twist, that leads me to make a connection with another related field of inquiry, which is narrative medicine. It's a connection that Zelkowski's excellent book does not fully concern itself with, but I would like to extend his thinking further to show how it resonates, how his readings of Hoffman, Freud, and Kafka resonate beyond the discourse of trauma. Particularly, again, that the call to witness in Zilkowski's own writing, the recognition that the traumatized other, past and present, continues to call out to us, this is Zilkowski, as we assiduously make our ears deaf, connects not only with the trauma of accidents and war, but with chronic illness, as we talked about last time. So we talked about Rita Sharon's narrative medicine, honoring stories of illness as an example, where Sharon calls upon physicians to approach patients with narrative awareness. We've talked about how Sharon's sense of narrative ethics exposes the fundamentally moral undertaking of selecting words to represent what before words chosen were formless and therefore invisible and unbearable. That quote was in the last essay too. She wants at least to grapple with the fact that words can create form where there seems formless. It seems formless. So based on his connections with narrative medicine and the sense of the ethical relation at its core, I am also tempted to put Zilkowski's book in conversation with other new books about the enigmatic etiology of chronic illness or pain. I don't know about you, but in 2020, I started reading obsessively chronicles of illness. Such books as What Doesn't Kill You? A Life with Chronic Illness, Lessons from a Body in Revolt by Tessa Miller, Cost of Living by Emily Maloney, are two of the many recent books that have theorized the importance of representation of illness, considering especially its indecipherable nature. All of these books in 2020, 2021, 2022 write about illness and say illness is indecipherable. For Miller, speaking on behalf of chronically ill people, quote, "It's the mental Olympics that challenge us, the depression and anxiety that come along with the malfunctioning body, the sick, sleepless nights worried about health insurance, the grieving of a self that doesn't exist anymore, the PTSD from long hospital stays and invasive procedures, the new rules of an unrecognizable body, the inescapable loneliness." Here we have the language of illness bound up with the language of trauma. That Miller refers here to such mental problems as PTSD, grief, depression, anxiety, and insurance worry in one breath is no accident. Often these happen together, with one exacerbating the next. But there is a way in which we can map the language of Miller's discussion of chronic illness onto Zilkowski's discussion of war trauma and railway accidents. PTSD rhetorically connects illness and traumatic events because each demands a witness, as we've discussed, and remains so difficult to master with language. The sign produced by the signifier and the signified that have an arbitrary relationship at best. The language cannot tell us the truth of an ill body. It seems to me, reading Zilkowski's book, that there is a reason that people who study language, English majors, and comparatists might gravitate toward theories of ethics, trauma, and medicine. At the heart of these discourses is a value for non-mastery, for leaving the question open. These discourses, trauma theory and narrative medicine alike, begin with the effect and then try to work their way back to a possible cause. Each possible cause spinning many stories with many words, many of which fail. As Zilkowski shows us, there is value in the literary approach in refusing mastery over a given history, illness, or experience, leaving room for an unspeakable to emerge in other ways. In tension with these approaches, of course, are the institutions that seek the truth. History books, for example, insurance companies, diagnoses added to the patient's chart. What Hoffman, Freud, and Kafka knew better than perhaps anyone is that these assurances are impossible and may only confound the problem, the return of the repressed to haunt a culture that has not adequately treated the sick or traumatized. Listen to the stories of those who suffer and accept the indeterminacy not only of language but of the very human experience we seek to communicate. This is not, I hope it's supposed to sound hopeful. That is, there are many possible stories to tell. This is deeply unsettling for a lot of people though, right? Like that we cannot get to the truth according to trauma studies. These kinds of questions seem ever more urgent. Zilkowsky is not simply writing about traumas that occurred generations ago, the Battle of Dresden, World War I, the First Balkan War, and he is not only talking about modern technology associated with trains and warfare, he is talking about illness, PTSD, mental illness, addiction, abuse, chronic conditions, all things that are not so easily defined. One more recent example that reflects Zilkowsky's approach is his discussion of 3 authors who were very much ahead of their times. It involves the COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020. Conversations surrounding COVID-19 representation seem eerily familiar in light of his argument about the various possible ways to represent trauma and illness, with perhaps more elusive literary approaches being more effective in describing the alienated experiences of inhabiting a body and witnessing history. The kind of elusive indirect writing stylized by Hoffman, Freud, and Kafka marks the difference between the more literary How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. We're going to be discussing that in a couple of days when we discuss COVID representation at a remove. As opposed to, say, Marie Brenner's The Desperate Hours, one hospital's fight to save a city on the pandemic front lines. The former is a science fiction novel that imagines a theme park for assisted suicide, a loose and devastating allegory for our inability to describe the loss of countless children during the pandemic. The latter, that is, one hospital's fight to save a city, draws on examples and stories of over 100 people who worked at New York Presbyterian at the height of the pandemic, often losing the emotional resonance we seek in a literary work that can be more successful in describing the experiential truths of living in the coronavirus age. So what I'm trying to say is, when I was trying to find comfort and a sense of explanation for COVID-19, I looked to literature as opposed to histories or tell-alls from the medical community. So in light of these important conversations, it seems unexpected that at the end of the year of 2021, trauma theory received such a pronounced backlash in such widely read publications as Harper's and The New Yorker. If trauma theory does seem adequate to the moment of real illness and trauma, then perhaps we need to work harder as trauma theorists to communicate its value to the larger world. My question is, how are these intellectuals not seeing it? We can see the need for such translations most prominently in Will Self's A Posthumous Shock, How Everything Became Trauma, in the December 2021 issue of Harper's Magazine, and shortly thereafter in Pearl Segal's essay entitled The Case Against the Trauma Plot, which appeared in the December 2027 issue of The New Yorker. The strange choice of venues for arguments against a very specific theoretical approach to reading literature notwithstanding, both essays seem to hinge on a bad faith rhetorical question. This is Self. Without being able to say anything definitive about literature, what, pray, is the point of literary critics? That hurts. What is the point of literary critics if they will not say anything definitive? Of course, the question can not only be read in bad faith if we assume Self is immersed in trauma theory. As we know from Carruth and Zilkowsky, among many others, the value of trauma theory lies in its refusal to say anything definitive. That's a value to me, to keep the question open. But as we've also seen in Zilkowsky's careful readings of Hoffman, Freud, and Freud, Kafka, Hoffman, this open-endedness is itself historically conditioned. Self's purpose for writing his takedown is pretty straightforward. This is Will Self in Harper's Magazine. I want to tell the story of how theories of textual interpretation dreamed up in the obscurity of the academy have bodied forth to sustain a novel conception of the traumas humans suffer. Indeed, part of what gives modern trauma theory its appeal is precisely its covert importations of Judeo-Christian redemptive eschatology, a grand narrative of human moral progress in which suffering is an essential motivation. That's how he understands trauma theory. I think by now we can all say a fair reading of Freud, Caruth, Zilkowsky, Shoshana Fellman, whom we've read, Dory Laub, and even Sharon and Juricic would suggest that a grand narrative of moral progress is the opposite of what is at stake in teaching and practicing modern trauma theory. And it is not uncontroversial to say that the Christian redemption story plays no role in the concept of the theory itself, and may, in fact, be what the theory most stridently works against. I think it's worth saying that Freud and Caruth were Jewish intellectuals, right? Are Jewish intellectuals. So the Christian moral progress story I thought was really interesting. Self begins with the familiar, incorrect notion that trauma studies and other postmodern theories argue there is no truth, a kind of relative determinism at its worth. However, if Zilkowsky's reading of Freud and Kafka tell us anything, it is that there is a value in considering the multiple truths languages can tell, given the problem of reference that has to do with a multiplicity of meanings rather than no meaning at all. Self writes, quote, "Just as early psychological theorists of trauma were preoccupied by the way traumatic experience seemed to confuse the possibility of wholly truthful recall, so these literary theorists of trauma are obsessed, and I don't think it's too strong, with the way their understanding of semantics confuses the possibility not just of trauma's effective representation, but of any effective representation at all." Again, I would propose that there is a difference between saying there are many ways effectively to represent human suffering, and that is a very different thing from eschewing any effective representation at all. Trauma theory is skeptical of the possibility of a fully complete representation. You helped me say this earlier, but it is absurd to suggest it forecloses any effective representation. To return to the ethical model, the relational model that is needed in trying to account for suffering of another, it seems to me that trauma theory is at its most useful when it leaves the classroom and enters clinics, hospitals, insurance agencies, counseling centers, and city streets to listen to all of the possible stories people tell about what ails them, and reflecting throughout the process of bearing witness on the ways that language can still betray us in its overdeterminacy or even its related counterpart, indeterminacy. I am far from the first academic and trauma theorist to come forward in defense of trauma theory. And while Zilkowsky's book is the ideal counterpoint to the logic of Self and Segal, one need not be committed solely to the study of humanities to see its value. In the Harper's letters to the editor that followed Self's piece, Caruth defends trauma's foundation on the dual values of a careful active listening and an openness to what is not yet fully understood. Do you ever read letters to the editor? It's basically like this person radically misunderstood what I was trying to say. So I imagine Kathy Caruth in the context of reading Harper's Magazine and seeing Will Self drag this theory, right? That like she's so well known for, like dedicated her career to, and thought, I'm just going to pen a letter to the editor to set the story straight. So she does get the final word in the next issue of Harper's, in the letters to the editor. She writes, "Between the subtle and resonant languages of trauma, which address us often enigmatically with a plea to listen, and a dogmatic discourse whose sole aim is to shut down listening, there can be no meeting." I love this. I am on the side of subtle, resonant language that addresses us enigmatically. Will Self, you are on the side of dogmatic discourse whose aim is to shut down listening. There can be no meeting. I love that. Caruth's response could easily be read as a charge against Self's own dogmatic writing, but it is also a warning for all of us to keep our ears open, to listen to the traumatic address of another who struggled to articulate her pain. For me and for Zilkowsky, this is the fundamental lesson of trauma theory. A theory that comes out of readings of such disparate authors of Hoffman, Freud, Kafka, individuals and thinkers who suffered the modern age in their own right. As Zelkowski argues, quote, "The problem then as now was not about pre-existing conditions. The problem then as now was not that there was no cause, but that there were too many. Overdetermination coincides here with indeterminacy." Too many causes. How do you make a diagnosis when you think there are too many possible causes? A theory of trauma, perhaps the original poetics of indeterminacy, helps us to see that to try to master an unimaginable history is to miss the point completely. For Zulkowski, this kind of aesthetic, this poetics of trauma, ends up telling us the most we might hope to know about life in the era of shock. In the era of shock, the era of the railway accident, the trench warfare of World War I, the bombing of Dresden and the Holocaust, the Vietnam War, up to the 2020s, the murder of George Floyd, the coronavirus pandemic, the invasion of Ukraine, the ecological disasters displacing communities and families. The list goes on and on and on today. I can update with news from the past day. We would do well to pay attention to a poetics that does not insist on a single truth claim. As this, quote, poetics exposes in negative form the pathology at the heart of modernity, our insistence on finding a material source for all of our pathologies. So writing from the point of view of modernism, he says that's where the modernists failed. They insisted on finding a single material source, which we can disagree with. I love the modernists. I think they're about much more than that, but the message is there. So in the end, speaking of personal pathology, my test results came in on the weekend of the 4th of July, 2 years ago? 3? 2 negative tests for RH with injury unlikely. What stared me in the face on a Sunday morning of a holiday weekend surprised me, rendered in its medical language no so straight and so sure. Left knee, synovial fluid, Lyme disease, DNA, detected flag A. I do not know what flag A means. I think that is probably not good. Pay attention, right? I'm a literary scholar. I know that the prognosis was not good. Late-stage Lyme arthritis is often very difficult to diagnose, so I'm lucky in that way. Even still, as my husband said at the end of the day, I almost wish it had been one of the other 2 possibilities, arthritis, injury. Lyme disease is the least, well known, maybe less knowable. For now, we leave the question open. We express gratitude for our diagnoses, right? Some of us are privileged with good insurance. The test told the insurers what they were looking for. There was a single cause to my suffering right there, in black and white. But for readers of Zulkowski's trauma book, we know when it comes to human suffering and disease, that is so rarely the case. So that is the end of lecture 3. Discussion questions related. So again, for your evaluation, you're going to choose one of, now you have 12 to choose from for today. Coming from this lecture, the questions are, what is the value of understanding indeterminacy at the heart of trauma theory? Cannot be determined, right? Cause, not determined. How might the sense of indeterminacy apply usefully to psychic illness and physical illness both? How would you characterize recent criticism of trauma theory? And how is the voice of Clorinda, remember Clorinda all those hours ago, echoed in Carruth's defense of trauma theory in her letters to the editor of Harper's Magazine? So let's go back to a passage or 2. We'll unpack it, and then we can return to one of the larger questions. Let me see, where did we start? I don't know, what do you think? We could look at Carruth, Freud, Zulkowski. will self. Do any of the medical humanities people want to weigh in here? This connection of indeterminacy with regard to medicine. The 19th and early 20th century discourses of medical trauma and language of skepticism converged in this disconnection of the signifier and signified. Medical researchers never stated this. They knew implicitly that medical symptoms resemble linguistic signs. Somebody want to pick that up? That's kind of chilling. It's late in the day. I could go to another passage too. Do you want to talk in terms of big picture? All right, let's look at Carew's takedown of will self, and then we'll look at big picture questions. Okay. I was thinking of Clorinda here. Between the subtle and resonant languages of trauma, which address us often enigmatically with a plea to listen, and a dogmatic discourse whose sole aim is to shut down listening, there can be no meeting. Key words here that stand out to you. Say again? Plea to listen. Thank you. What is a plea to listen? How does that connect with what we've been saying? Yes, thank you. Trauma demands to be listened to. You say it. Yeah.
Trauma demands to be listened. Why? Because when we see historically, the memory help us to to save the culture, history, culture, identity, to not to fully lose it.
Yes.
So it demands to be listened. After listen, it is need to be scripted, so that it can go from generation to generation, so that the language, the identity and the culture of that community or whatnot. So it is preserved through it.
Yes, absolutely. We need stories to pass on culture, kind of legacy, history, right? What happens when people stop listening? So again, this is the child in the dream of the burning child. Can't you see? This is Clorinda's voice coming from the tree, right? This is like a plea to listen to the voice that speaks from outside, from beyond. Okay, other phrases. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So the one word that is important, I think, is enigmatically.
Yes.
What Caruth tries to say is that trauma addresses us often enigmatically or in abstract terms. But what is the problem with the editor, I think, is that he thinks that these abstract or the expression of trauma in abstract terms is not direct. He thinks that it should be direct and tangible,
Great.
not something which is intangible.
Yes. Yeah, we are kind of uncomfortable with this idea of an enigma, right? Or something that, I mean, this is what literary scholars also take up. Like, how do you interpret these enigmatic things? It could have many, poetically written language, dense language could have many possible meanings. That seems to go against, an impulse for a truth claim or, objective, reality.
And it is actually open to many interpretations.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So she's saying, we need to focus on resonant languages, on enigmatic languages, with the plea to listen.
So what I think is, she tries to say that even if it is not clear to us what it actually means,
Yes,
it can have different meanings,
yes,
but we have to accept that as it is.
yes. I love it. And so, like, Will Self, she's reading Will Self's criticism as dogmatic, as like shutting down listening. Um, that's pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, thank you.
so I'm thinking about shutdown listening.
Yeah.
So when we read about chronic illnesses and trauma, one of the things that makes people uncomfortable is that there is an expiration date they set to how long you can speak about it.
Yes, yes.
Like even in Kafka's scenario, he was ill for a long time, and anyone with a chronic illness, they are ill for a very long time, and after a point, like Kafka said, you are a topic under the carpet. When someone tries to talk about you, or when you talk about your own illness, they want to shut down the listening.
Great.
That is exactly what the people who are criticizing trauma theory
I love it.
is also doing. Like, there is a shutdown the listening is
love it.
shut down. And most often the one of the criticisms against trauma theory is like it is equated with poverty porn and stuff like that.
Yes.
Like, where you show pain to make it artistically appealing, and like that is one of the criticisms that has been against it.
Yeah.
So here I feel like shutdown listening is very important part to that letter.
Yeah, that's such a great point. That is, people who are suffering, and this goes back to the interview with Pinsky and the other activists from the last lecture. They're like, we need to keep telling our stories. We need, like, repeatedly to talk about the alienation, the symptoms, like, that just doesn't go away. And then for, other people to say, like, you already told me about that, or I cannot listen another minute to, you are suffering. That's also at play in the shutting down. Yeah, I mean, there cannot be an expiration date on a need to talk about one's suffering.
The phrase shut down listening, I think we can go back to the first lecture and talk about the phrase the otherness of voice. Like we talk about the otherness of animals or the third gender. So there's also an otherness of voice, where this voice is not something very loud which needs to be said every time. This voice is more of a very subtle voice that Karut is talking about, I think.
I love that. And I think that comes from Carus's reading of philosophers like Levinas, who like thinks about our relationship with the others, right? It's not too hard to listen to somebody who shares your experiences, but what if someone else's story is like different or alienating, or you don't know how to situate yourself within that story? That's precisely the moment where you put yourself out there, and like, you don't have to take it on board, right? Without imposing your own background on what is being said. So that's another great reading of like an ethical listening, a refusal to shut down. I'm wondering what you think. Like, hearing this out loud, like, there can be no meeting. I'm thinking, that's not the Kathy I know. Like, according to her theory, would she need to sit down with Will Self and say, tell me about, like, what led you to this reading of trauma theory? Is that an effective response? Yeah. Okay.
There is already setting conditions, what to speak,
Yes, I see.
what they want to listen.
Yes,
So
I
I think
see.
that this dogmatic discourse is something that she's not happy with.
Yes, that's a
Yeah.
great point. He's already like shut down the
Yeah.
point of meeting. That's really great. Yeah, so dogmatism has no place in a theory of trauma. That's lovely. So we can go to I don't know, is there any one of these questions you're all thinking about writing about this evening? We talked about indeterminacy earlier in terms of non-mastery. I really wanted to emphasize that today. We can think about psychic illness and physical illness. like, do you have any ideas? Like, my third is really selfish. Like, do you have any idea about where this criticism would come from in a moment where it seemed like we were all kind of locked in our own private and public traumas? So, I don't know, is there anything in there you want to take up in our last few minutes? Okay, we're good. It's been a long day. Yeah. Do you want to say? You want the last word? Oh, okay. Yeah. So I would just say, like, we talked a lot about train accidents today, and we talked about my own like Lyme arthritis. But think about all the other ways that we can think about like non-mastery or indeterminacy when confronting trauma in the form of illness, psychic illness, mental illness. I'm really interested in addiction, in the unhoused, in displaced people. There are all kinds of applications, it seems to me, for this kind of reading of human experience. So I think that ends lecture 3, right? And also day 1. Does everybody, before we part for the day, is everybody clear on the assessment? Okay, you feel good? Are there any questions that you want clarity on?
Paper.
Yeah. Pen and yes. Yeah, so pen and paper, typed paper. If you have access to a printer, that might be hard for people who came from far away. No chat, yeah. If you were recording this message, ooh, that's another thing to add to the lecture later on, like trauma and ChatGPT. If you were recording this message, ChatGPT probably will not do very well with it. We'll see. Yeah, just but the point of that point is we really just want to hear from you, like what kinds of thoughts you have in response to these kinds of questions. So. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening in this beautiful city, and we'll see you tomorrow, right? Yes? Okay.